everybody. Good afternoon. Hope you enjoyed your second buffet meal of the day. Another one coming later. Great. So our next speaker has been researching ancient Egypt for a couple or 3 decades. He first came here in 1981. I would have been 80 years old. I didn't come with him. I didn't come here until several years later, but he's been researching it for that long. He's famous, or infamous, for discovering the cave system behind the Tomb of the Birds on the Giza Plateau, which even Zahi Hawass, our new friend, made a comment of in one of his TV shows, Chasing Mummies, I believe it was. Andrew's been researching the area of southeast Turkey long before Göbekli Tepe was ever discovered. It was almost like he was there researching it, expecting something to turn up, and eventually it actually did in the mid-90s. He was one of the first researchers of our ilk to go there in 2004 and explore the site, document it, and really put it on the map. So he's spoken at Megalithomania 3 times now. I organise the Origins Conference in London with Andrew. We do that every November, early November. And we've been working on projects and tours for the last few years. Please give a warm welcome to Andrew Collins.
Thank you very much. Right, okay, well obviously it's a pleasure to meet you all, and obviously to be on this Kemet School tour here, which I've enjoyed immensely, and got to know some great people and had some great conversations. And a lot of what I've talked about so far, I've made sure I've incorporated into the lecture itself. So, but on the other hand, there's an awful lot of things that I've left out. So we just have to go through. There's about 140 slides, and just rush through them and see where we go, basically. So let's start with a familiar site. Obviously, the 3 main pyramids at Giza. Now, you'll have to accept that I'm looking at things from a slightly more conventional way than maybe some of my colleagues, because in my opinion, the 3 pyramids are the result of the constructions of the 3 4th dynasty pharaohs, Khufu, Khafre and Menkaure. Okay, all these pictures, by the way, taken this week in the Egyptian Museum. So that was a good opportunity. And right next to the little tiny image of Khufu is this wonderful overhead photograph of the Giza Plateau. And of course this is what they look like from above. And where do you start to try and unravel the pyramids, basically? And you know, it's one of these things that people have been trying to do for the last 200 or 300 years, with most of the people ending up being referred to as pyramidians. Well, I'm one of those, and I've actually been referred to as such by my good friend Mr. Zahi Hawass. But I don't care, who cares? So the first thing that you have to consider when looking at the pyramids and anything to do with any kind of cosmology or religion or religious practices behind them is that the 3 pyramids at Giza are all aligned towards the north. And what I mean by that is that if you're going inside them, you're going into what we call the entrances, the entrance passageways. But what we have to remember is that they weren't designed for us. They weren't designed for us to go inside and visit. They were designed for a soul inside a chamber to come out. So actually these are exits. And all of these exits, not just with the pyramids at Giza, but virtually every other pyramid that was constructed during the Old Kingdom period, and many right the way through to the Middle Kingdom, all are orientated towards the north. In other words, they have almost like these gun barrel like chambers that point towards the north. Why? What's in the north? What's so interesting about the north? Well, we have no knowledge of the significance of the north simply from, let's say, the Great Pyramid. There are no inscriptions at all in the first pyramid, the second pyramid and the third pyramid. There are various inscriptions in the tombs that are contemporary on the Giza Plateau, but these are from the the priestly caste, maybe some family members, the nobles, things like that. So there is a possibility that whatever is said on the walls of those tombs may not be connected with where the king himself went. In other words, there may be some kind of elite journey involved, which, for information of, we've got to look elsewhere. And that elsewhere is in the pyramids that were built just a short while after, certainly within a century, at places like Abu Sir and Saqqara, because suddenly we find that their interiors are covered in hieroglyphic texts, which have become known as the pyramid texts. And what these are all of the sayings and spells and the trials and the tribulations that the pharaoh has to endure as he passes through something known as the duat, which we interpret in terms of the underworld, to reach the afterlife. Okay? And repeatedly in these pyramid texts, the pharaoh is equated with the god Osiris. And the reason why he's equated with Osiris is because Osiris is involved with a mythological story where his brother Set kills him and forces him inside this coffin, and it's a whole story about his wife Isis trying to revive him and also conceiving their son Horus. So Osiris is not just god of the dead, he is the dead god, the god that is dead, which is why the pharaoh at the point of death becomes him. Remember that all pharaohs themselves are considered divine anyway, just like the emperors were of Rome, for instance, or of China or anywhere else in the world. And repeatedly, the pharaoh as Osiris is associated with the sun god Re. And what happens, obviously, when the sun sets is it goes down in the west and goes under the earth and rises in the east the next morning. Well, that underworld that it goes through overnight is equated with this duat underworld. So in other words, that's where this duat is seen. It's under the earth. But of course, the Egyptians weren't stupid. I mean, they realised that the sun wasn't literally going through a hole in the earth, but that it was going under the earth, and the stars went with it, and those stars also rose up in the morning as well. Oh, sorry, in theory. I mean, obviously, you wouldn't be able to see them in the morning, but you can see them in the early morning light before the sun rises. And essentially, the route taken by the soul, according to the pyramid texts, is that it starts in the west, goes in the underworld, and is passing from west to east, and it rises up before the sunrise in something which is generally referred to as the well, it's still the same term, the duat, but it's seen as like the first signs of dawn, basically. Like the redness that appears when you can still see the stars. And at this point, it goes up and is received by this god known as Sa, okay? Sometimes referred to as Sahu, and Sa's sister, who's called Sopdet. Now, Sa is Orion, and Sopdet is Sirius, okay? So basically, the pharaoh goes up and is greeted by Orion and by Sirius, which both rise in the eastern part of the sky. I mean, obviously, over time it changes exactly where they rise, but essentially it's in that part of the sky. However, the journey does not end there, because what happens next, according to the pyramid texts and their placement, is that the soul then turns 90 degrees and goes towards the north, towards a set of stars known as the imperishable stars. Now, the reason why they're imperishable is in theory because they either never set, because they're revolving around what's known as the northern celestial pole, the turning point of the heavens as you look towards the north. Remember, if you're in Egypt and you look south, you wouldn't see the southern pole because you're clearly north of the equator. And some of my colleagues dispute that the pyramid texts say that the soul goes towards the north. But the two last people that did translations of the pyramid text, R.O. Falconer and James P. Allen, the last two people both have sections in their commentaries that say it's very clear that the final destination of the soul is in the north. It goes from west to east and then to north towards the imperishable stars. Now, as to the identity of those, we'll come on to those shortly. Okay. And the idea, by the way, of the soul going towards the north, towards some kind of point of origin, where it came from in the first place and returning to in death, is almost universal, certainly in the northern hemisphere. So it's nothing unusual that we find it. But the idea in Egypt, as contained in the pyramid text, is that that to achieve this access to the afterlife, the soul of the deceased has to virtually go back from where they've come. They have to go back into the womb of their primeval or cosmic mother, who we'll be looking at shortly. And everything is geared towards that. The pyramids, in my opinion, are tombs. However, I think that term is very inaccurate. Because, if we think in terms of a tomb, we think of something in a churchyard. It's not like that at all. It would be better to call them ascension machines, basically, because that was the idea. The idea was to literally create a transition of the soul from the physical environment to a stellar environment where the soul would actually become a star, or would actually be visible as a star amongst the imperishable stars. But also it would enter an afterlife which wasn't that different to ours, because it would have a second birth. In other words, that's the ultimate destination of life. You have this second birth into the afterlife itself. Now, the directionality of the pyramid texts is found within many of the chambers of the pyramids from the Old Kingdom onwards. The sarcophagus is always generally in the west, and there is an area that moves through the sarcophagus chamber, generally through a connecting chamber, into what we call an anteroom, although that's probably not the correct term. Many of them have what are known as serdabs, which is like this weird chapel in the east. And remember, all these are covered in pyramid texts from the later period. But all the pyramid texts then continue into this area here, which is the exit corridor. And the idea of the very last texts, which are protecting the soul on its final exit from the pyramid, is to then blast it, like going through some gun barrel towards the north. And that's exactly what happens. Now, that's in the pyramids that have got the text. Those that haven't got the text, i.e. those at Giza, still follow the same general format. Even though there are extra chambers and bits and pieces, the format is essentially the same. And this is the Great Pyramid. The sarcophagus is in the west, just like the later ones. There is an area through. It's been proposed that this double-sized chamber, the King's Chamber, may have actually had some kind of screen originally, allowing the soul to rise up and go to the east. And then there's no serdab there, although there is in the Queen's Chamber down below. And it will then turn and go north, out of the north into the northern, the Grand Gallery, and then out into space, basically towards the north. Okay, and this was all worked out by James P. Allen, the last person that did the translations of the pyramid text. So this is pretty well established stuff. So where was the cosmic womb of the mother of Osiris, the mother of Re, who were both exactly the same, and it was a sky goddess we'll talk about shortly, called Nuit. Okay, which star was he going to? Was it just in general, or was there somewhere specific that he was going? Okay, well, to answer that question, we have to look more closely at Giza and ask whether there was some kind of grand design in the actual placement of the pyramids itself. And what we find is that this was indeed the case, because there are a number of quite simple pieces of geometry that tell us that whoever constructed the pyramid field did it to absolute precision. I mean, for instance, just a few simple things to start with. There is a hill, which we'll talk about shortly, there called Jebel El Gibli. Gibli, I'm pronouncing that, please excuse me, which we'll come on to in a minute. And this seems to be like it's almost survey point. And an exact equilateral triangle can be drawn between there and the vertex, the apex of the Great Pyramid and the apex of the Third Pyramid. Plus, from the same spot, you can take a line up and then cross it to the apex of the Second Pyramid and back to the same spot, which is a place called Jebel Gibli. I mean, that's just very basic stuff. Basically, I mean, myself and my engineer friend Rodney Howe looked at this many years ago. It's written in my book, Belief the Pyramids. It's going in the new book, The Cygnus Key. But this is just the beginning of it, to be honest. And Jebel Gibli, for those of you who don't know, is it's about 425 metres to the south of the head of the Sphinx. Okay. Sometimes it's known as the Fourth Pyramid. It's a very strange place. Here's a very old image taken from the top of it. And there's no question that it's a place that you stand. In the 1980s, Dr. Mark Lerner started his Giza plateau mapping project from that very spot. That was their first survey point. They then went all the way round the plateau, mapping it digitally, and they came back and within something like 5 centimetres of their start point, created a digital map, which is the one that you now use essentially for all work to do with plotting the pyramids and other monuments and their relationship to the stars. It's not simply done by getting Google Earth and drawing a few lines. It has to be done properly. So this is the view that you get from the top of Jebel Gibli. And it has various names, and there are a few legends connected with it. But one that I particularly like, I was told in the 2000s by an Egyptian who lived locally, and he said that it was actually known as Tafaya, which, where's Yosef? You're here?
I'm here.
Yeah. He said that this meant something like the place of the beginning or the starting point. But I don't think Tafaya in Arabic actually means that, does it? But Tafaya.
That means what's on the edge.
Right, oh well there, okay. But the way that he explained it was it meant the start point, the beginning, basically. Which to me made a lot of sense, because if it was the original survey point, that would be remembered locally in, folklore and legend. I'm pretty sure of it. Now, the next thing that you realise about the Giza pyramids clearly is that if there are 3 of them, they're on an arc. I mean, any 3 points creates an arc of a circle. So if you look for the centre of that circle and you take it from the centre of the top of the second pyramid, it actually comes out, I'll show you where it comes out, here in the southeast. It's about 2 kilometres to the southeast of the apex of the second pyramid. Okay? But what's interesting is immediately it goes, and this is all digitally done, remember, it's almost exactly through the point of Jebel Gibli, which we call the datum or the datum point, which seems to be a bit of a coincidence as well. But this is just a start, because if you continue that's on that same line for another kilometre, so just under 3 kilometres, and you would have stood that at that spot around 2550 BC down to about 2500. The 3 wing stars of the constellation of Cygnus, the celestial bird or swan, all would have been seen one after the other to set down perfectly. And this is digitally done, remember, this is not just drawing lines on a map. It's into the apexes of those 3 pyramids. And this is essentially what you would have seen, right? These are the 3 wing stars of Cygnus, and let's just show you what they do. Right, the first one would come down onto the third pyramid, the second one obviously down onto the second pyramid, and then the third one down onto the apex of the Great Pyramid itself. Okay, these are the wing stars of Cygnus, and you would have viewed this from this location that we refer to as the convergence point, and very close by it, and it's actually on a street called Zaglu, get correct pronunciation, which runs north-south, and it's in the town of Nazla El Batram, as I said, to the southeast of Giza. And myself and my engineer friend, we did a survey thing. We actually found that there is a mound, or was a mound, at the exact position. And myself and JJ and Hugh went to the spot last week. And although we had to climb up to see this now because it's built, that's the exact position. And those are the three pyramids as you see from that spot. So from this position, 2,550 down to about 2,500, the time frame that I consider the construction of the pyramids took place, you would have seen those stars setting down onto it as from that position. So, I mean, you know, that's interesting enough, but then it gets even weirder, because if you then go from the vertical into the horizontal and look down on the three pyramids, they exactly match those same three stars in their astronomical positions. They reflect the geographical positions of the three pyramids. Now, obviously, you'll have heard about the whole Orion mystery and the rest of it. All I want to show you here is that there are alternatives, and that the Cygnus correlation, as we call it, at Giza, works both in the horizontal plane and in the vertical plane, which means it's three-dimensional completely. And that is just a straightforward overlay of stars on the three pyramids. We'll talk about the Deneb spot, as we call it, before we end. Another major star in Cygnus is actually on the top of Jebel Ghibli itself, which may be chance or design, not sure. But even more, if you actually stand on the top of Jebel Ghibli itself, due to the placement, the exact height of it, everything, something else weird is seen. The brightest star of Cygnus, Deneb, sets perfectly down into the apex of the second pyramid in the same time frame, 250 to 2500 BC. And again, that's exactly it. This is digitally created from all the information from the Giza Plateau mapping project and proper, sky programs. Could all be coincidence, who knows? But it starts to get a little interesting. So how did Cygnus, if indeed it was important, become important in ancient Egypt? Well, the key is the fact that an American astronomer named R.A. Wells, or Ronald A. Wells, worked out that the sky goddess Nut, just spelled N-U-T generally, was actually a personification in the sky of the Milky Way as it's seen in the northern hemisphere, and that the images of Nut that show her as this naked goddess arching over the earth is actually the Milky Way. Hold on, I've got a picture here. Now, if you can see this is the Milky Way as it appears in the north sky, exactly as I say. Now, most of us don't get a chance to see the Milky Way in its totality from horizon to horizon. But, I mean, I was lucky enough to see it once in Texas, and it's extraordinary. I mean, it goes from one horizon. It's just like a rainbow, white rainbow at night. And there's no way that this was not greatly important to the ancients. And they would have based a lot of their cosmology and religious ideas around its presence and around the fact that it's seen as almost like a road or a vehicle that allows the soul to get to the other world. Right, now just going back to this one. And going back to the pyramid text, because what they make clear is that the soul of the deceased is going back to his cosmic mother, and that's Nut, going back to the womb of his cosmic mother, and that womb is in the area of the constellation of Cygnus, and that's why Cygnus is important in ancient Egypt, and why it's important to the layout and design of the three main pyramids of Giza, because it represents the cosmic womb of Nuit, and it's where the souls of those three kings, in theory, I mean, you know, if they were originally put there, we don't know, maybe they were, maybe they weren't, but they were constructed for that reason, to go back to the cosmic womb of their mother. And remember, they've taken the form of Osiris, you know, the dead god, but also of Re, the sun, who both of those, Osiris and Re, are both the sons of Nuit. And the coffin, the sarcophagus, and even the tomb itself were representations of her womb. That's actually mentioned in the pyramid text itself. So, in other words, you go into the tomb room, the chamber, the burial chamber. You go into the sarcophagus. You go into the coffins within it. All of them are representative of going back into the womb of the mother. And Nuit herself is even shown in the form of Cygnus, as far as I'm concerned, in a later period, during the Middle Kingdom period. I mean, that's the way she's depicted there. And if you overlay the stars of Cygnus as they appeared at this time, it's almost a perfect match. And in these, the first intermediate period, which is even before the Middle Kingdom, that she starts appearing like this. There she is again. This image here, this hieroglyph above her, represents the sky. And these were the four main constellations, or asterisms as they're called, that were important to the ancient Egyptians at this time. You have Nuit, who represents the Milky Way stroke Cygnus. You have the bull, the foreleg of the bull, which is often shown also as a torso of a bull or even a whole bull, and that's Ursa Major. There two in the northern sky, and the two in the southern sky is the god Sa, who is Orion, and Sokdat, who is Sirius. Those were the four props, the main supports of the sky. And of course, obviously in later periods it starts getting a bit confused, but that shows you all those were on the coffin lids during this period, and I'm certain that they were important much earlier than that. But these two sites that I talked to you, the site I talked about before, Jebel Gibli, is far more important than simply what we've shown to do with this basic geometry, because it has a relationship to the Sphinx which needs to be brought out. And I think what's important to point out about the Sphinx is that this isn't just some carved statue that they brought along and put in place. This is carved out of the natural bedrock. It's carved out of a knoll or a promontory that would have been visible above the ground for, I'm going to say, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of years. It would have been orientated east-west. One end of it would have been very much like a head, and I suspect that even before it was carved, and I personally believe that it is older than the time of Khafre, but perhaps not that much, in my opinion, for various reasons to do with the Sphinx enclosure and the quarry behind it, all suggest that this was the actual Sphinx enclosure was carved out after the causeway by its side, because it abuts it. It means it must have been done after that causeway to the second pyramid was put in place. So that means it can't be that old, the actual enclosure itself. But the actual monument itself is extremely old and would have been visible in the past. Now, that's how it was discovered in the 19th century, by Napoleon's people and others, or how they perceived it. In fact, I think this is an image that's even older than that. And the head was visible, part of the back would have been visible if indeed, there was all of the sand was removed around it. It would have been there. You would have seen it. It would have existed. And it's, in my opinion, and also an archaeologist by the name of Serena Love has done a lot of work on this, and she believes that the Sphinx promontory, as a natural monument with some kind of simulacra, perhaps that of a dog or of a large feline, most obviously a lion, had existed for thousands of years before the Pyramid Age, and that it was something of veneration that drew the interest in the plateau in the first place. And I think that that's true, but because it was orientated east-west, and that would have followed the sun setting in the west, and the sun would have been seen to go underneath and rise in the east, I think it became a symbol of the guardian of the underworld, which indeed exactly what it did. It became the lion, and also the fox or the wolf became the symbol of the guardian of the soul as it goes into the underworld. And eventually it gets carved into the form we see it, probably initially as a lion, although Robert Temple thinks it was a dog, and eventually it's usurped in the form that we see it here. But going back to the very basics, look at this. If you draw a line from the top of Jebel Ghibli to the head of the Sphinx, you can do a few very, very interesting things. Because if you take the line to the top of the Sphinx, it hits almost the south, well, right on the southeast corner of the second pyramid. And if you take a line back to the same spot, it creates a perfect 3, 4, 5 triangle. Now that's what they call a right angle triangle or a Pythagorean triangle. The side of 3 between the Sphinx and the datum, side of 4 between the Sphinx head and the southeast corner of the second pyramid, and the side of 5, the hypotenuse going back to Jebel Ghibli. Interesting. And what's interesting about the southeast corner of the second pyramid is that there is a massive megalithic platform in the southeast corner supporting the pyramid, because it had to be built up because it was on a slope. And in 1977-78, the Stanford Research Institute, Ain Shams University of Cairo, did work there, and there's big hollow cavities there. Something's down there. If you're looking for the Hall of Records, that's where to start looking for your entrance, okay? But I noticed something else pretty quickly after creating this 3, 4, 5, because if you've got the hypotenuse of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, if you extend it one length further and create a sixth part, it takes you to the exact point of the vertex of the second pyramid. Now you might say, okay, well that's interesting, but what's your justification for doing that? Well, you might have heard me talk about this guy when we were in KV6, Kings Valley 6 the other day, which is the Ramesses the Ninth. Because this gentleman here, Frenchman, René Svala de Lubitz, artist, alchemist, in 1936 visited the Valley of the Kings, and he saw this on the wall of Ramesses IX. Various of us saw this the other day, because I deliberately wanted to find this and get photographs of it. And it's the pharaoh in the form of the god Amun-Min. And it originally would have had an erect phallus there as well, which tells you that it is Amun-Min. Now Amun-Min is a god of agriculture, of fecundity, of fertility. But he's resting on this snake that goes around here. And that snake forms a perfect 3, 4, 5 triangle. That was something that Svala de Lubitz realised. But the extension of the hands of the pharaoh creates an exact extra unit, making 6 now instead of 5. But once he did this, he realised something incredibly significant, because if the original hypotenuse was an ideal value of 1, that would make the whole lot with the 6 1.2. And what he realised to do with that, and I won't worry too much about that, is that, and I'll read this out because it needs to him, this provided compelling evidence the ancient Egyptians knew the value of both phi and phi for 1.2, that is 6/5 times phi, 1.68 squared equals 3.1 blah blah blah, which is the value of phi. Now this blew his head, because he then considered that the ancient Egyptians must have known about both phi and pi and phi, okay? And he then spent the next decade or so looking into all of the temples at the Luxor and Giza and other parts of Egypt, trying to understand the symbolism and the meaning behind the monuments, the architecture, and wrote some incredible books on it. So that's my justification for putting that 6th unit. But that can be built on from there, because that's the original 345 that you just saw. We'll call that the base 345. If you flip it, and by the way, this idea of flipping these and using 345s, let's go back to this, is something that was in ancient Egyptian tradition anyway. They had what's known as rope pullers, or rope stretchers. And they would actually get a cord with these knots in to create 345 triangles to measure out land like this. And in this way they could start creating rectangular areas, rectilinear areas to define boundaries of land or whatever. So yeah, this is totally the norm. Plus, Amun Min, the god, is always portrayed in this way. I pointed this out to a few people on the tour. He holds this threshing instrument, which is, you know, for threshing the wheat and whatever. And he doesn't actually hold it. His hand is in the middle. Why would that be? The answer is that the exact angle of the threshing instrument is a 3-4-5 triangle. So in other words, it's emphasising that the geometry is important. He's not just holding an instrument for the sake of it, basically. So if we ourselves flip that 3-4-5 to the north, something else happens, because it creates within a couple of metres, a few metres, the vertex line, the latitude of the vertex of the Great Pyramid. I think that's interesting. Okay, let's see if we can carry on here. Well, if you then draw another line through the north-south line of the vertex of the second pyramid and half it from the original datum line, it hits the apex of the Great Pyramid. So basically, in a matter of 5 to 6 moves, you can create all the positions of all the monuments other than the third pyramid. So how does that fit into the picture? Well, we've already got that one, because you can put a perfect triangle between the apex of that, apex of the Great Pyramid, and that point on Jebel Gibli. Done. You don't need all the complicated geometry, that scribbled lines all over maps or whatever. The whole lot can be done in 6 moves. You can get within just a couple of metres, every single monument, main monument, and many others fit into this as well, which we won't even worry about today. So I was anxious to try and find out what the length of this one of these units would be. Like the original 3-4-5. I wondered, is there some significance in these parts of the base triangle? What did it measure? And I asked Rodney Hale, my engineer friend, to look it up, and he wrote back that it was 5671.5 inches, 144 metres, which turns out to be exactly 270 long cubits, or 45 reeds, which is something that's not generally used in Egypt, but it's interesting anyway. So I thought, that's interesting. Then I suddenly realised that that's exactly the height of the second pyramid. Exactly the height of it. So, and what's so weird is that the actual height to the base width of the pyramid is 3-2. Well, 3-2 is exactly those double pyramids. But what's so interesting about this is that if you go back to the base 3-4-5 again, you've got your unit of 1, your side with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The 6th unit takes you to the point where you can create the vertex. But the actual height of the second pyramid now becomes the 7th unit. Is this a coincidence? It seems bizarre if it is. So in other words, the second pyramid is a perfect extension of this basic geometry. As I said, 2 by 3. So if that's 2 by 3, you can fit it perfectly into this other geometry as we see there. So there it is. Let's just flip it on its side and I'll show you what I mean. Look, so you can put the second pyramid in there absolutely precisely. It fits perfectly into the geometry. And just to confirm it, there's a double form of your Ramesses IX image as Min Amen, and there's the second pyramid perfectly in place. The geometry could not be any more perfect. This shows, without any doubt in my mind, that the 3-4-5 triangle was the instrumental key to creating the base geometry at Giza. But we can take it on because, remember, we have this line going from the second pyramid through Jebel Gibli, through the centre of the arc circle, which creates the arc of the three pyramids. That line continues to the convergence point where you see the 3 stars of Cygnus setting down. They're all on a virtually perfect line, within just a few metres. But I started playing around with bigger geometry, and I found that if you create just a perfect triangle that hits Dashur, Red Pyramid, the Red Pyramid of Dashur, which, remember, in theory was built just before the Great Pyramid, so may well have a relationship to its placement. You create that, it hits the area of Jebel Tura, which is where the fine limestone that was used on the facing blocks of various of the temples around Egypt and some of the pyramids was constructed. It's a spot which is interesting, but unfortunately we can't investigate it because there's a quarry on the spot today. But if you then put this line that goes through, it actually cuts it perfectly in half. But more than that, it hits somewhere called Helwan, which is on the other side of the Nile. It's about 20 to 25, I can't remember exactly, about 25 kilometres southeast of Giza's second pyramid. And that's really, really, really interesting because Helwan is a location that most of you will probably know nothing about. I knew nothing about it at all up until a couple of years ago. But it turns out this place is extremely important. And the essential story is that in the 19th century, it was realised that the whole load of springs that were there, lots of them, at least a dozen, had incredible healing properties. And they created like a spa resort there, with its own hotels, golf course. They even got a railway line in from Cairo. And Europeans would come there and spend time because the air was so pure there that it would cure a lot of ailments and diseases. And here's an advert here for the Grand Hotel at Helwan. And here's one of the springs. And it's interesting because in ancient Egyptian, the name that's given to Helwan is An or Anu or Ayan or Awin, which is obviously the same as Yusuf and his family, and obviously Patricia as well. Although I've asked them about that, and they believe that the origin of their name comes from the south of Egypt. But that name means spring or eye, okay? And it obviously comes from the springs that existed at Helwan in the past, which unquestionably had an importance to the ancient Egyptians themselves. By the way, they created a sanatorium there, they did various other things. Now, because from the beginning of dynastic history, they created the most incredible cemeteries at Helwan, including the use of megalithic blocks from as early as about 3000 BC. And here's an image here, which appeared in 19th century papers. I actually bought one of these to use in the book to show the huge great Tura limestone blocks that were in use from about 3000 to at least 2800 BC and possibly later. Obviously, this is hundreds of years before the Great Pyramid itself. And indeed, in the 1940s and 50s, an Egyptologist by the name of Zaki Syed actually uncovered 10,000 tombs at Helwan. Just to show how important the other thing is that it actually forms precisely on something known as the division or the balance of the two lands. Basically Samatawi, which is represented by something that we were seen on a number of different chairs or thrones of kings over the past few days, and generally shows either Horus and Set either side of this weird spine-like device, which is actually a sarcophagus tube, and this here is lungs pulling at the two different main types of plants of Upper and Lower Egypt, which is, and excuse me, I'm getting them in the wrong order, but I think it's the lotus and the papyrus. And this represents the absolute balance and order between Upper and Lower Egypt, which, remember, were brought together at the beginning of dynastic history by the pharaoh Menes. And the king himself, because these were on these thrones, that it was almost like this line extended through his own lungs, the sarcophagus, as if like his breathing in and out continued this lifeblood of Egypt for both the north and the south, and keeping this balance. Well, that line starts at Memphis, which is generally associated with, that's the balance of the two lands, or the place of the two lands. But it crosses the Nile and goes through Helwan, which in ancient time, as I said, is known as Iwan, and or Ayan, or Ain, or even Ainu. And this, I think, is incredibly significant because it could be telling us that Helwan was very important even before the time of the pharaohs. And this seems to be the case because once all these Europeans started, having vacations, holidays in Helwan, something very interesting started to happen. They started to find hundreds and thousands of stone tools. They would pick them all up, generally in the vicinity of these springs. And some of these tools were extremely well made. And these, they handed them to museums, they gave them to people that mattered, and they were presented to some of the early Egyptologists like Auguste Mariette, to the big French Egyptologists, and various other ones that were working here, and they dismissed them. They said they're too fine, they're nothing. They must be from the Arab period or something like that. But these were actually extremely old, some of them going back to 18,000 BC. And showing early cultures that existed at Helwan, and clearly creating incredibly advanced settlements even at the time of the last ice age. And then there would appear to be a hiatus during what's known as the Younger Dryas period, when we know that there was a cataclysm in the world that devastated everything, and then occupation restarts at Helwan around 8000 BC. And what I didn't realise is that Klaus Schmidt, who we've been talking about, Göbekli Tepe, the guy that rediscovered Göbekli Tepe in 1994, in 1996 actually wrote a whole article all about Helwan and its early culture, and he said it's basically the same culture that was at Göbekli Tepe, the pre-pottery Neolithic people, but I'll come on to that in a second. I'm leaping ahead of myself here. Now, I've also found evidence that another name of Helwan in the past was Bennu. And the word Bennu relates to the bird of creation. It's the bird, I think I've got, here we go, the bird that was said to have landed on this thing called the Ben stone at the beginning of time to create the first, at the moment that the first day started to create time itself, basically, the passage of time. Usually represented as a heron-like bird, although its exact species seems to vary and may not even be known. And in Greek myth, we know this Bennu bird as the phoenix. So this bird seems to be associated with Helwan. So what's going on here? Well, at Edfu, which sadly we won't be able to go to on this trip, there are what's known as the Edfu building texts. I think Patricia mentioned them in her lecture, and these contain the foundations of ancient Egypt, going all the way back to some kind of mythical age known as Zep Tepe. They also talk about this primeval stone, like this Ben stone, as it's actually called. That's called the Ben stone. But they have another name for it. It's called the Jed Pillar, and and another name as well. And it talks about this primeval bird again, landing on it. But in these texts, it's actually a falcon that lands on it. And it said that everything grows out from there. The first enclosure, the first temple, and then they start building other parts of Egypt. But what's so interesting is that a woman, an Egyptologist by the name of E.A.E. Raymond of Manchester University, did a complete commentary all about the Edfu building texts that came out, I think, in 1969, I'm going to say. And she said that it's very clear that the place of origin of these texts is not the southern Egypt around Edfu, but in the area around Memphis. And she made a couple of suggestions, but for some reason didn't actually mention Helwan. And yet there are clear references in the Edfu account to the fact that the very foundation of this earliest enclosure was around these springs. And I'm certain it relates to Helwan, and I go into this in detail. So why don't we remember Helwan? Why has it been lost? Well, the fact is its memory and its creation myth was stolen by another cult centre, a cult centre that we all know today as Heliopolis. And the Egyptian name for Heliopolis was, and I'll try and pronounce it correct here, was Un, right? On variations of Un, Unu or Anu. Please excuse my pronunciation, Joseph. And usually this name is translated as the city of the pillars, and the reason why it's pillars in plural is that there were records that I think were preserved in early Arab times of these twin obelisks that were used as gnomons to mark the sun's course. So the early Egyptologists believed that the hieroglyphs used for it related to these twin pillars, but I don't think so. By the way, these are the hieroglyphs that are used for Heliopolis, which is this pillar, which is what it is. The pot, and I'll come on to that now once we'll show this. This was a picture taken the other day. Joseph pointed out, that Heliopolis' name was on one of the temples that we saw at Karnak. I photographed it, and this is it. The pot is essentially the hieroglyph for Nu. The pillar is An, and this symbol here means city. So it means the city of Anu, basically, or An or Anu. And that, I think, was its original name. It was pillar, not pillars, and the pillar was the Ben stone, the original stone. But this was the same name as Helwan itself. And as far as I'm concerned, there's every indication, and certain Egyptologists have said this, that Heliopolis is not the place of first creation of Egypt. It was further south at Helwan. I've talked to Yosef about this, I've talked to Patricia, and they agree that this is the case. And Yosef even says there is a saying, which I'm sure you'll tell me now, in Egypt about life began, or Helwan. What is it, Yosef?
The word Helwan itself is coming from ancient Egyptian word Her-Un, the cave of Un.
Yeah, the place of Un. Yeah, so that's confirmation that it is the place of An or Un. But there was another saying you said that the Egyptians say.
The popular sentence.
Yeah.
Yes, that who built Egypt? His origins is from Helwan.
Yeah. So there's an Egyptian Arabic saying that Egyptians say that says that the origins are from Helwan, and that confirms everything that I have put together to do with Helwan. I think it was incredibly important even before Giza, and I asked the artist Russell Hussein to try and put together an image of what we think this primeval temple looked like based on the account from the Edfu building texts and what temple enclosures existed around 8000 BC, and this is the result. And it would have had this primeval pillar in the centre. It would have been associated, I think, with the bird cult, because the Edfu texts talk about this figure called the falcon being in charge of the whole thing, and it would have looked something like this, I believe. Now, some of you are already beginning to think, well, hold on, doesn't that look a little bit like somewhere else in the ancient world? And the answer is yes, it does. Because where does Helwan's culture come from? Certainly at this time, around 8000 BC. And the clue has been staring us in the face for years. And it was Klaus Schmidt who basically pointed all of this out and put the whole lot together. And this is the fact that in the 19th century, these early Europeans found these beautiful stone points which became known as Helwan points. And here are various examples of them. Almost all of them, except for maybe one or two, don't exist anymore, or they've been lost. And they're very, very distinctive, with these cuts in here and the stars. And the way that they're manufactured is very technologically advanced. And the reason, obviously, they're called Helwan is because the Helwan points they found there first. But gradually, they were found in other places in the Levant. And an article was written in the 70s suggesting that maybe their point of origin was the Middle Euphrates. However, this was written before examples, even older, were found at Göbekli Tepe, Navali Chori, and at another cult centre at Şanlıurfa, which is 8 kilometres or 5 miles away from Göbekli Tepe, which takes us on to Göbekli Tepe, because all the indications are that whatever was going on at Göbekli Tepe comes down through the Levant, is present at Helwan around 8000 BC. And that's very important to remember because of what we find at Göbekli Tepe itself. Now, for those of you who don't know anything about it, it was discovered in the mid-1990s by this German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt. And what's so weird is that at the exact time that they were putting the first spade into the ground, I was writing a book called From the Ashes of Angels, and this pinpointed this area and said that something very special happened in it in the past. Some kind of weird elite group were here that created that allowed this to become the cradle of civilization, the first in many different inventions, and that it was also the Garden of Eden, as remembered in biblical tradition. I also felt that this was the origin of the stories of the Watchers and the Nephilim of the Book of Enoch, and I also felt that it was connected with the Anunnaki, something that has now been written about by myself, by Klaus Schmidt, various other people, suggested that the founders of Göbekli Tepe in myth were remembered as the Anunnaki, which, by the way, Anunnaki means the gods of heaven and earth. Their original name was the Anunna, which means the sky people, basically. So it's weird. Anyway, I managed to get out to Göbekli Tepe for the first time in 2004, and there was nobody there. There was just the local farmer and his son came over to say hi. And the stones were just half excavated at this time. I mean, this is enclosure D, which will show you, and barely the heads were actually shown. You could just walk around, just do whatever, basically. And there's more pictures that we took at the time. So these are the main pillars from enclosure D. But that's what it looks like today, and it's arguably the most important archaeological site in the world. Dates to 11,500 years ago, 9,500 BC. It was operational for about 1,500 years, and you have incredible T-shaped pillars in stone circles with beautiful carvings on that are unbelievable. Bearing in mind this was built just after the end of the last ice age, is another enclosure called enclosure C, that the tops of the stones were unfortunately broken off in antiquity. And they were built into the bedrock, but the whole thing is like this layer cake of activity within a mound that's around 300 metres by about 200 metres, inside about 15 metres tall, which is about 45 feet. And the earliest stuff was built on the bedrock, and then once they decided they didn't want to use that particular temple, they covered that one over, built another one by the side, or they covered it up and built one on top, and they gradually did this, creating this layer cake of activity. So the oldest are on the bottom, the youngest are on top. That around 8000 BC, the whole site was abandoned, and these people went elsewhere. And I think that one of the places they went to was Helwan in Egypt. These are the twin central pillars in enclosure D. All of the enclosures have these twin central pillars in them, which seem to be like the central focus. They're almost like gateways to somewhere. Just a few silly images thrown in. Some of the carvings of animals there are really weird and unique. There's these birds here, which I suggest are probably dodos in one of my books. There was no dodos in southeast Turkey at this time, so how did they manage to see those? This is the weird thing. Hugh showed this. It's a very weird totem pole that was found in one of the enclosures there. I mean, it's got these really weird snakes up here. There's a person. This person's got an animal head, possibly of a bear or possibly of a lion. It's got weird ears, and coming out of its stomach is a second baby or something, and out of that is another baby. I mean, it's very, very odd. And that third baby, or third person, is holding this pot. It's just extraordinary. You can see some of the other weird animals by the side of it, that were also found at Göbekli. Weird statue found there. That's found at Göbekli Tepe. That was found at Tiwanaku. They're almost identical. Why? And what's that? What the hell is that found at Göbekli Tepe? It's a dinosaur, isn't it? No, I don't think it's a dinosaur at all. But it's obviously some fierce creature that they wanted to portray. But it does look like a dinosaur. And there are glyphs on the side of some of these stones. I mean, this one's got these weird H-shaped things with these crescents. H shape is something that myself and JJ have been talking a lot about. It represents the interaction between this world and the next. It's found in the Balkal designs in the Maya, various other parts of the world, and various other designs like, there you go, that's on the side, and then on the front of this one you've got H things. This weird symbol here, which I think represents a three-tailed comet. Comets, I think, were very, very important to this culture. This is obviously a fox's tail that hangs down here. Foxes were very important to the cult of the priest shamans at Göbekli Tepe. But the stone that attracts the most attention at the site is known as Pillar 43, or the Vulture Stone. And it's located in the north-northwest here. The actual enclosures generally are orientated north-northwest to south-southeast, and I'll show you why in a second. And on this Pillar 43 you have this weird shaped vulture with these W-shaped wings. You have a scorpion there and various other creatures on it. So what do they represent? Well, a few years ago a archaeoastronomer by the name of Juan Belmonte identified the Scorpio in a paper as Scorpius, one of the 12 signs of the zodiac, and if that's the case, then quite clearly the other figures may well be astronomical. And my colleague, that's the actual pillar itself, you can see there, and my colleague Rodney Hale, I think, really worked the whole lot out very nicely, because there's this weird bull above the arm of the vulture, and there's a line, right, let's go back to that, show you to that, there's a line here. This line almost certainly represents the horizon, and when that's taken into account and you put like a meridian line in, a north-south meridian line, and then show it against the stars of the sky for when it was constructed around 9,500 BC, everything lines up perfectly with the northern celestial pole. The stars of Scorpius exactly in their place there, look where it is. Cygnus up here, and various other sky figures fit into place as well. In other words, this is a perfect map of the soul in the form of a skull or head, which was often symbolised just by the balls, these balls, like a sphere, in the art of the early Neolithic in Southeast Asia, Southeast Anatolia, modern day Turkey. And what we find is that all of the main enclosures at Göbekli Tepe are aligned through their twin central pillars towards the bright star Deneb in the constellation of Cygnus. So it's the same constellation that we find in connection with the pyramid Giza. The pyramids of Giza is also present at Göbekli Tepe. So there's a relationship. Not only that, but because Cygnus is actually on the Milky Way at the exact point where it breaks into two to form two separate branches caused by something known as the dark rift, then this was always seen as a point of entry into the sky world. And I think that this was something that was known to the Göbekli Tepe builders, and as you'll see was much, much older even than that. On top of this, there is the same geometry that we find at Giza is also present at Göbekli Tepe. And this is the first time I've shown this out actually, so this is pretty impressive. Firstly, I noticed that one of the smaller but very important enclosures, known as the Lion's Pillar building, with these two pillars here which got incredible lions on them, was perfectly 3/4 in shape. In other words, you could put these two, 3, 4, 5, because obviously you can mirror that one to there. So it was a perfect 3/4 rectangle. And I thought, this is just too coincidental. So we started looking at the ovoid enclosures at Göbekli Tepe to see if they also had any kind of geometry, and they also had exact 3/4 geometry. This is enclosure D, and this is a ellipsoid. It is not an ovoid, an ellipsoid based upon the 3/4. So in other words, it's 3 parts that way, 4 that way, and it fits perfectly with the stones. But more than that is that the centre line of it goes precisely through what's known as a porthole stone, which is like a standing stone with a hole through it, which I'll show you in a second. Plus, if you divide the long axis into 3 parts, it perfectly marks the positions of the 2 central pillars perfectly. I mean, that cannot be coincidence. This has been done on purpose. You have to start asking yourself, why? By the way, there's this whole stone. That's what it looks like. It faces into the centre. It's the only stone that faces into the centre. So it's clearly in a position like an altar in a church, or a central focus. The Holy of Holies is a stone with a hole in it. In much later times, these stones with the holes in them would be replaced by benches, which obviously become the first altars. So this is the direction. That's there. Vulture stones next to it. So all of this makes absolute sense. This is enclosure C, has exactly the same geometry, the 4/3. I mean, originally there was an outer ring of stones, and at some point they decided that it was too big. They were going to make it smaller, so they actually created a smaller ring inside, which actually messed it up slightly as far as what was on the outside, because there is another second hold stone also perfectly aligned with this 3/4 ellipsoid shape, and I'll show you that one now. That's there. It's broken, and it has the hole through it. Part of it's missing, but it's in exactly the right place for it. So in other words, that was the Holy of Holies of the second enclosure, and then there's a third enclosure, which is the third most, the oldest one. Well, there's 3 that are really old, which is enclosure H, which they're still investigating now. That too conforms to this 4/3 ratio. And going away from Göbekli Tepe south at another site, which has gone out of my head at the moment, come back to me, built essentially by the same culture as Göbekli Tepe, exactly the same thing. This is known as the House of the Oryx. It's a place in Syria. Can you remember? I can't remember. It's huge. Got the place, but anyway, not to worry for me. Gone out of my head. Exactly the same geometry there, and this was the cult building of that particular site as well. So, origins, advanced human behaviour, sacred geometry, ancient cosmologies, and thus civilization itself. So I'm rushing through some of this, obviously because we've got so much. So, firstly, why was this particular shape so important? Essentially, it's connected with sound and music, because the 4/3, the relationship of 4/3 in musical instruments creates something called the musical interval of the perfect fourth. The relationship of the double form of that, which is the relationship of 3-2, creates what's known as the perfect fifth. If you need somebody to talk to about this, Lucian's your man. I've been having some long conversations with him about this, relating to the importance of the use of this type of geometry in architecture. And of course, a room is almost like the inside of a huge, great instrument that, like a violin or whatever. In other words, if it's all done perfectly to design with the geometry, it will reflect the same sound, the same resonance. So where do all these ideas come from? Well, there's a bit of a gap here, which you'll have to take my word for at the moment, which relates to looking at the earliest evidence of what archaeologists call advanced human behaviour. And this involves everything from stone tool technologies to the creation of things like needles, and where the origins of these may come from. And you can trace them all back to the earliest point. And that point seems to lead us in one direction, and that is Siberia. Somewhere that's not really been on the map until the last decade, for a very, very good reason, because in 2008 some fossil remains, human fossil remains, were found in a cave known as the Denisova Cave in southern Siberia in what's known as the Altai Mountains. And when they were examined, when the genome was extracted, what they found was that they belonged to a type of human population that was now extinct. And because it was found in the Denisova Cave, they called them the Denisovans, or the Denisovans, as I like to call them. I've probably got it wrong, to be honest, but anyway, and this is the cave. And so what do we know about them? They certainly around from around 800,000 years ago down to about 40,000 years ago, when they seem to go extinct. And although the fossil remains of them is actually quite meagre at this point, it's actually only 4 confirmed objects, fossils, which have all been DNA tested. All of them belong to Denisovans. And what they tell us, quite specifically, is that the Denisovans were big, extremely big. And when I say big, I mean they got in size and in height. Every single piece. There's 3 different teeth and 1 finger bone that's been found, and all of them are oversized. Okay, but the information that we can gain from this tells us a hell of a lot about who the Denisovans were and how far they reached. Plus, the level of activity in the Denisova Cave has revealed some remarkable, advanced human behaviour, if you like. By the way, in a TV documentary that Nat Geo did, they referred to one of the molars as a giant tooth from a rather big individual. This is from one of from a guy called Ben Sviola, paleoanthropologist at the Max Planck Institute. They're the ones that actually, sequenced the genome of there. And when it was first found, this one was so large that they actually thought it was from a cave bear. And this is remarkable. This is a piece of jewellery, some kind of bangle or bracelet, as they refer to it, that was found in the level of the Denisovans and is now accepted not just to be manufactured by the Denisovans, but to be 60 to 70,000 years old. And it would have been worn probably on the upper arm, and it had a hole through it, which they believe would have had some kind of cord attached to it, and possibly a ring or something connected with that. But the finish of this is absolute sophistication, and you don't see anything like this from that point onwards until the early Neolithic period. In fact, the same culture as Göbekli Tepe, a place called Ashikli Hoyak, dating to about 10,000 years ago. And it's made of something called chlorite, which is a form of chlorite. And the importance about this is it changes colour. It's different in the day to what it is at night. and it's very likely that the use of this stone was chosen for that reason. And it was probably worn by a woman, perhaps an elite person, or even a shamaness. And this is what it would have looked like, they believe. And I mean, it's just a remarkable piece that, I mean, I realised the significance of this many years ago, and you know, other of my colleagues are now on to this subject. They found the earliest needle in the world in the same layer as the Denisovans. So clearly the Denisovans were not just using needles. In fact, there's not one, there's at least two needles come out from the same layer. That tells us that they were manufacturing fur and leather clothes, obviously to combat the cold. This was not a good time to live. As much as 60, 70,000 years ago. This is the oldest needles, and you can trace the evolution of needles from the Denisova cave out into Europe, down into Southwest Asia, and it's a remarkable piece. Plus, there's evidence that the Denisovans rode horses, domesticated and rode horses. Not my idea. Look, here we go. 50,000-year-old DNA found in Denisova cave. Did extinct human species ride them or hunt them? And there is good possibility that they were riding horses. These people were incredibly sophisticated. Not only this, but arguably either the oldest or the second oldest musical instrument in the world comes from the Denisovan layer. In the Denisova cave, it is a flute, a very basic flute, possibly part of a larger one, which shows that they had a knowledge of music. And although I don't know exactly what this one's manufactured of, others that were found in that area from a slightly later date are all made of bird bones, and with the swan and the goose being the most obvious ones. And the swan would seem to have been a key symbol in this area from the very earliest times. Just a little bit to the east of the Denisova cave, near the huge inland sea called Lake Baikal, there was a site called Malta that was operational around 24,000 years ago. And these people, their main totemic symbol was the swan. They would create these swan pendants. Not only would they put them in burials, but they would align them. They were found aligned inside dwellings, north-south. And a leading Russian archaeologist that's looked into Siberian archaeology in this area said that very clearly they were orientating them north-south to do with the migration of birds, the fact that the soul becomes a bird in death, a universal idea, and that this is the earliest manifestation that we have of animism, i.e. shamanism, in Siberia, associated with the swan. The swan is unquestionably, in many cultures of the Eurasian continent, the bird associated with music and sound the most. It's connected with the cults of Apollo, the cults of Orpheus, the cult of the Muses in Greek tradition, which you can show that these all originate in a place called Hyperborea, which was originally a place connected with the area of the Altai Mountains, the very area of Siberia. So somehow the swan became associated with music, most likely through the use of swan flutes at a very, very early date. And the area of sky associated with the swan is the area of Cygnus and the stars in the vicinity, known as the summer triangle. It was believed that this influence, what's known in Greek tradition as the music of the spheres, came and was focused on this area of the sky. Why? Why was this area associated with it? Well, I think a lot of it is to do with the fact that in the past, the stars of Cygnus also, at certain times, occupied the position of the northern celestial pole. In other words, they were the turning point of the heavens, the point of entry from this world into the next. It was ideas that, although changed because of precession, were remembered across time, right the way through into Giza and right the way through into the Pyramid Age of Giza. And I believe that the Denisovan legacy finally ends up creating the pyramids of Giza and all of the great things that were incorporated into that. Our own ancestors met the Denisovans. This is the latest estimate in new surveys that came out between 54 and 44,000 years ago. I write all about this first meeting in my new book, The Cygnus Key, and the impact of it. I mean, they've got the Denisovans the back to them because we don't really know what they look like, but I'll come on to that in a second. And those are obviously our ancestors up there who are sort of more recognisable. And exactly how this meeting went down, we don't know. But the one thing that we can say for certain is that prior to us coming along, let's say, 40, 50,000 years ago, the most intelligent, the most advanced people on the planet were the Denisovans, far more so than the Neanderthals. And if you're looking for someone for the origins of civilization, this is it. I don't think I'm going to go into this, but basically the common ancestor behind the Denisovans and the Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were these people called Homo heidelbergensis. And I think that there's a good chance that they are closer to Denisovans than any other extinct hominin species of the past. And Homo heidelbergensis were also known to be extremely large. This is a jaw that was found in Heidelberg in 1907, known as the Mauers jaw, and it's absolutely massive. Plus, in South Africa, when Homo heidelbergensis bones are found, they're routinely over 7 feet tall, according to Professor Lee Berger in 2007. So what did the Denisovans actually look like? Well, to start off with, we haven't got a skull, so we can only conjecture that it probably had similarities to the Neanderthal skull, probably had a swept back head, probably quite elongated. Would have looked pretty weird, but the one thing that we do know about these people is that they were massive. They were very wide and tall, and I would say that the closest that we can come to them is what I'm going to show you in a second, and that's not that. That's a skull that was found off of Taiwan that could end up being Denisovan when it's actually confirmed a few years ago. Okay, big reveal then now. That is what a Denisovan looks like. There are certain differences. I don't think that Denisovans had chins like that. That's a human trait. But in size, that's what they look like. I believe that they are the giants of old. I believe that the hybrids of the Denisovans went on to influence the foundations of civilization in both the old and the new world. I'm currently writing a book with Greg Little about their influence in America, which will come out next year. But that, I think, is closest that we get. This is the great Kali. I think he was born in India. Who knows? You may even have the Denisovan blood in it, because there's Denisovan DNA in a lot of places in the world. Most obviously in Melanesia, Australia, in Eastern Asia, in China, Japan, in India, the eastern, southern part of India, in Myanmar, in the old Burma, and it's mostly in the east. There's a reason for that. I'm not even going to worry too much, but it's got a lot to do with the easterly migrations of our own ancestors. And there are legends of giants in the area of the Denisova cave. I mean, this is so close in appearance to this guy, it's really weird, and this was done completely separate to anything to do with the Denisovans. And they're actually referred to in some accounts as the white-eyed people. And the reason why they're referred to as the white-eyed people is that they had no pupils. It looked like they had white and only a black eyeball. So they must have looked really weird. And this is actually a trait of albinism. And I do believe there's a connection between albinism and Denisovan hybrids. I go into this in the book to a degree, and I think there's a relationship. There's some connection with hybridisation and albinism. By the way, going back to that, there's a lot of stories about these giants creating the first monuments, the first bridges, the first irrigation channels, and the first megalithic monuments in the area of Siberia. And although I think somebody else asked Hugh a question about the Siberian super megaliths, I agree with Hugh that they are probably going to be natural blocks. but some of them do look like they could have been moved around, and it may have been by artificial means. And if that's the case, then it was done an extremely long time ago, and there is a possibility, I think, that the Denisovans did create the first megalithic monuments. Now, they may just have picked things up and, you know, leaned something against something else, but it would, in effect, have created the first megalithic monuments. Just really quickly, Malta, this site I mentioned earlier, all these swan pendants, this incredible stone, I think it's mammoth ivory tablet was found. Every single one of these spirals and the amount of numbers relates to cosmic numbers, all revolving around eclipse cycles and precessional cycles. The total number is 487 on it, but the way they break down is they have a relationship with a number that crops up in a very ancient calendar in the very same area. It's still there today, revolving around the number 432. And this number is created from a combination of eclipse cycles and the precession of the sun itself. And I believe that this actually comes from the Denisovans itself. And these numbers, all based on multiples of 432, are found all over the world, from Cambodia to China to India to Northern Europe, where else, other places as well. And they're universal. And I mean, people like Graham Hancock and others have talked about these strange cosmic numbers. Where did they come from? Well, the answer is they come from Siberia. They're there at least 24,000 years ago, and it's my opinion that they originate with the Denisovans. It's there with the pyramids as well. Although you normally see the width of the sides of the pyramids as 440 cubits, in a long cubit it's 432. So, which is weird because the 440 and 432, all to do with hertz and music is a big debate. In long cubits it's 432, and of course we also know, I'm sure, that the Great Pyramid is 1/432,000th scale model of the Northern Hemisphere. And there are various other 432s relating to this, which suggests to me that the Great Pyramid represents the divisions and subdivisions of a cosmic time cycles. Okay? So where does all this come from? Now, there's something else called the Nineveh constant. Some of you may have heard of this. In the 19th century, at the city of Nineveh in northern Assyria, now northern Iraq, but used to be Assyria, they found this clay tablet. It had a lot of mathematical numbers on it. One of which seems to be the biggest was, I can't remember how many, something like 11 figures long, and it was just astronomical. And an ex-NASA engineer by the name of Maurice Chatelain looked at this, and he worked out that it related to time, and that it could actually be broken down into seconds, and wrote a whole load of stuff. He saw it related to the sun and the moon, the positions and whatever. Very interesting in its own right. But what he also worked out is that it was just slightly out from modern calendars and the movement of the sun and the moon today. And he calculated backwards and found that it works for a date of 60 to 70,000 years ago. Now, a writer you probably know, sadly no longer with us, Colin Wilson, wrote various books like From Atlantis to the Sphinx, The Atlantis Blueprint, and about 90 other books during his lifetime. I knew him very well. Was very interested in the Nineveh constant, and he wondered how the ancients could possibly have known such long numbers. And he came to the conclusion that before modern humans were around, there must have been a type of human population existing that had the mindset to remember these numbers, and he compared them and suggested that they had a link with autism and savant mindset. Now, obviously, if you've seen the film Rain Man or whatever, or have any knowledge of autism or Asperger's or whatever, you know that people that have this particular what would you call it condition have an incredible connection with things like numbers and shapes and colours or whatever, and that what Colin Wilson worked out is that I wonder if our ancestors, not our ancestors, but the ancestors that came before us, had this type of mindset. Because for them, you know, numbers of 10, 11 digits would have been nothing. It would just have been their norm to actually have done this. And he came to the conclusion, and this was in a appendix of his book, I can't remember which one it was now, either From Atlantis to the Sphinx or the Atlantis Blueprint, one of the two, was related to the Neanderthals. However, this was just a couple of years before the genome of the Denisovans was actually found. And I think that had he waited for a couple of years, and as I say, he's now no longer with us anyway, he would unquestionably have focused in his attentions on the Denisovans and come to the same conclusion. And the reason I say that is because when the genome of the Denisovans were actually sequenced, it was found that they had genes relating to autism. That doesn't mean they were necessarily autistic in the way that we know today, but that their brain operated on a different level to us. And I think there's every reason why they may have invented all of what we've shown today, particularly everything to do with the geometry, mathematics, cosmology, and all these different ideas to do with music, and created something that was gifted to us probably around 45,000 years ago when we first enter into Siberia, and it's then passed on to the hybrids, the Neanderthal, and also Neanderthal and Denisovan hybrids, and that, you know, it then passes down to us today. The other important thing is that if autism is involved, then this is interesting because it might actually also tell us about the origins of shamanism, where a lot of these ideas would have been passed down anyway. Because obviously with shamanism it revolves around rituals, and obviously with rituals it's about doing things several times, you know, touching certain things, going around circles several times. All of the actions of the shaman suggest a connection with autism. Stuff's already been written about this, I quote this in the book, and I think that the origins of shamanism, which is most obvious anywhere in the world, in Siberia, have a relationship to this hybridisation that goes back to the Denisovans themselves, and that this is how it was carried. Right, nearly done, but people asked for this and I've got to chuck this in. And this is another whole lecture completely coming up now, but it's not, because I've only got a couple of slides. As Hugh said, one of the things that I'm infamous for, I think as opposed to famous, was that in March 2008 we rediscovered a cave system beneath the Giza plateau, which exists beneath, but beyond something that we now know as the Tomb of the Birds. And this wasn't something that we just fell into one day. It was the end product of about 5 years research with a colleague of mine by the name of Nigel Skinner Simpson, and we pinned down bit by bit from old accounts 200 years ago, the earliest around 175 years ago, that there was a cave system at Giza that had been forgotten, and we eventually pinned down our focus. Now the reason why I started to pin down our focus in this area, in the northwest, is because once I'd overlaid the stars of Cygnus on the three pyramids, what it left was the star Deneb, which is the brightest star of Cygnus, without any obvious marker. There is actually what's known as a mastaba tomb there, which was interesting, but so what, you know, sort of thing. It wasn't exactly a pyramid. So I started to look around this area to see if there's anything of importance. I came across this reference to this tomb, which didn't seem to be properly designated at all originally. There's certainly nothing published, where they found a load of bird mummies and were removed by Howard Weiss and his engineer friend John Perry around around 1840, and this corresponded to another reference that we had to a guy called, was it Henry? Was it William Salt or Henry Salt? I can't remember now. Who was the British consul in Egypt around 1820? Talked about himself and this Italian guy going into, called Caviglia, going into these caves and exploring them for a distance of something like 300 yards, and then going on and doing it. We worked out where we worked out that it had to be in this area up here. So in 2007, myself, my former wife Sue, actually tracked down this tomb, which there was nothing published about it at all. Nothing anywhere, not in any book. Subsequently, we found a reference that was unpublished that George Reisner, who was American Egyptologist who was working at Giza just before the Second World War, had actually designated this tomb NC2, which is North Cliff 2. But it's now popularly known as the Tomb of the Birds because of the bird mummies. We went there in 2007. We didn't find anything. It was a weird but an interesting tomb, but nothing more. But we found further evidence after this that suggested that this was the entrance into the cave world. And we went back in March 2008, and this time found the entrance into a massive natural cave system that went on for some distance. This is just the opening chamber here. I mean, that's me. There, that's Nigel. And it was massive and extremely dangerous and full of bats. And very dark, obviously. I mean, it wasn't as nicely illuminated as this. And we explored it for a distance of about, I think, something like 110 metres or something like that. And it then shrinks down into a small tube. We didn't go any further. We went in there in total 4 occasions, exploring and recording as we went along. And as there's me inside it. I mean, it's natural. It's been there for tens of thousands of years, possibly even hundreds of thousands of years. There's no artefacts in there. There was a small mummy, piece of a mummy at one point not far from the entrance. And there's some weird chamfering on the rock, like lines, these parallel lines, which were obviously done at some point. They're not functional because some of them were underneath the faces of the rock. It opens out into this quite open area eventually. Oops, sorry, it's not on its show. And but it got us into trouble, quite obviously. I mean, firstly, we did actually tell the guy in charge of excavations, an Egyptologist, that very night. We tried to get on outside and tell him what we'd found, and could he help us, go back there and look at the site better. I'm so glad we did. And then eventually we actually went to see Zoe Hawass in his offices at Cairo to tell him and show him photographs. I mean, he'd already been informed via a mutual friend who was John Van Auken of the Edward Casey Foundation about the discovery. And I've got to tell you the story. I mean, basically, myself and my ex-wife went in to see Zoe Hawass to tell him all about this. And we sat down, I explained it to him. There was a moment of silence, and he just threw his arms up in the air and said, "We know everything about the Giza Plateau. You can discover nothing. Amateurs can discover nothing. And, this is just a tube. It's, it's just a normal lake period tube. There's nothing to see." Or words to this effect. And then just silence again. And my ex-wife just burst out laughing. I thought, that's a little inappropriate. But it was when we got outside, and I said, "What the hell were you doing?" And she said, "I thought he was joking." And it was at that point that I actually got Zoe Hawass for the first time. Because he had to say that. He had to say that. What else could he say? "Oh yeah, thank you very much for you amateurs for finding this. We'll take it from here." Because it would make them look weak. It would make him look weak. And with his mindset, if he looks weak, his enemies will attack, and it will all be over for him and his career. And the one thing I've realised about Zoe Hawass, and I mean, he's almost like the pantomime dame in a pantomime. Like if you're in England or Australia, you'll know what I talk about. In America, maybe not. where you have these, these characters where everybody boos and hisses whenever they come on stage. Well, that's what Zabi Hawass is about, basically. I mean, he's an arse, obviously, probably corrupt and whatever, of course. But but what's amusing is that he's got this exterior persona that he projects in public. In private, he's a completely different person. He believes in all this weird shit that we're into. I mean, his doctorate was going to be actually funded by the Edgar Casey Foundation. They got him, were actually sending him to university. This was back in the 1980s, I believe. And, so he's very much associated with the mysteries. He believes in the idea of the whole records and everything, which is one of the reasons why so much work was allowed to take place on the Giza Plateau during the 1990s. But it obviously all went wrong, because of certain, people revealing stuff in books and stuff like this. But anyway, so that was that. But then a few years ago, I was informed that this story about our going into these caves, by the way, loads of people claimed that they knew about them afterwards. But Zabi Hawass didn't know anything about them, because 6 months later, after we went to see him, he was on television in this reality show called Chasing Mummy. Is it Chasing Mummies?
Yeah.
Going into these caves, he clearly didn't know they existed, even though we told him. And him saying this is the most incredible experience he'd ever had at Giza. So he didn't know they existed. And say other people say, oh, we knew about them all along. Well, why didn't they publish anything about them? Why didn't they say anything to anybody about them? Why aren't they in any books? And it's ridiculous to say that we were the first people in there. Of course we weren't. But, it was the end of a research project. We did it as a paper. And, we worked out exactly where they were. And that was that. But here's the thing. You probably know this story about these German guys, these German researchers, I'm going to say about 4 or 5 years ago, who supposedly chipped some hieroglyphs inside the Great Pyramid, inside the relieving chamber. And they stupidly put the whole thing up on YouTube. The Egyptian government went mental and demanded back, the ochre paint that had been removed. Obviously, they wanted to try and date it to see how old the Great Pyramid was. And they were obviously now back in Germany, and a court case came up where they were actually convicted in their absence, I think like 5 years imprisonment. So they won't be coming back to Egypt anytime soon, very clearly. So, but here's the thing. As this court case was going through, it was found out that just before they'd gone into the Great Pyramid to try and chip away these hieroglyphs, which by the way are graffiti marks inside the relieving chambers. Some people claim that they're fakes. I don't believe they're fakes at all, personally. Not as Graham Hancock and many of my colleagues. But anyway, just before they went in the relieving chambers, they went into the caves. So somehow they spoke to the right people, gave the right backsheets, and they went in there. And it came out in the court case that they'd gone into these caves. So, of course, the judge and everyone saying, sorry, hold on, go back one moment. Sorry, what caves? Giza? Oh, the ones in Andrew Collins' book. Sorry, who's Andrew Collins? So suddenly, all the attention starts getting focused on me and my ex-wife. There's pictures of us in all the Egyptian and Arabic press, basically almost accusing us of all sorts of bad things, of doing illegal this, that and the other, going into these caves. And for a little while, I was a little bit worried about coming back to Egypt, but clearly I've been arrested, so it seems to be okay. But what I had to do is I worked with Robert Bouval, who was in touch with the people who were trying to sort this out in Egypt, and I had to write an account, like a timeline of everything that happened, when we went in the caves, who we spoke to and everything, and just thank God we spoke to the guy in charge of excavations. It was an Egyptologist that night, because if we hadn't reported it, we would have been in serious trouble. So that's the story, basically. Right, my new book, The Cygnus Key, is out next month. Well, it's actually May, but it's actually going to be released at, I'll come back to them, at the New Living Expo event at San Mateo Event Center in San Francisco. Whatever date that is, well, it's the end of April actually, we'll find out. That's the cover. All the stuff essentially I've said today, other than the cave stuff, is in there. Although it actually does mention the caves a few times actually in there. These are some of the books that I've done. Here's an Arabic version of my book beneath the Tutankhamun book, which we've never been paid for. And some of my other ones, obviously Light Quest is another subject altogether. From the Ashes of Angels, that's the one I mentioned. Göbekli Tepe, that came out in 2014. And the Cygnus Mystery came out in 2006, which was my first real interest in Cygnus Mystery. But I decided to write another book because the bastard publishers wouldn't give me the rights back. So I thought, buggy, I'm going to write a new book with Cygnus in the title. But it ended up being a completely different book. Right, yes, obviously tours. Myself and Hugh and JJ are going to Göbekli Tepe in October this year. If you want to come along, I'd love to see you there. All the details at andrewcollins.com, megalithomania.co.uk. We're going to all the groovy sites, Chatham Hoyak, Cappadocia, and various other places. It's in October. And we're trying to get together a tour to Siberia for July 2019. We're working with the people we normally work with, which is Travel the Unknown. It's there basically, but we can't release the full details at the moment. But if you're interested, talk to us. We're going to all the great sites, including obviously the Denisova Cave, all the sites with giants and shamanism and everything, which will be great. And I just thought I'd put a really stupid picture in to end. We're also going to Angkor Wat next year, myself, JJ and Hugh, on a tour, which you can find out about. And obviously andrewcollins.com, follow me on Facebook and Twitter. That was at Machu Picchu. That's what happens at the end of one of these tours, so wait for that to happen. Right, so thank you very much, everybody.